My name is David Cunningham. I am professor of religion at Hope College in Holland, Michigan. And I'm here at the conference really as a representative of the Network for Vocation in Undergraduate Education. The acronym for that is NetView. I have NetView's website up here on the screen. It is run by an organization called the Council of Independent Colleges, which is a consortium of about 600 private or independent liberal arts colleges and universities. And within their work, they do the Council of Independent Colleges does a lot of work to bring those colleges and universities into conversation with one another about topics of common interest. And one of the initiatives that's important for their organization is NetView. And NetView is a somewhat smaller consortium, but it's also a consortium of colleges and universities, about 200 of them, who are interested in this concept of vocation as a way of thinking about undergraduate education. So I want to say a little bit about that and the general notion to begin with, and then we have some panelists with us today who have written essays for a recently published book on this subject, who are going to talk a little bit about their particular areas of interest and give you a little bit more of an idea of what that's all about. So, why vocation? About 15 years ago, an Indianapolis-based foundation, the Lilly Endowment, decided that the idea of vocation might be an interesting way for colleges and universities to think about how students think about their own futures. Not just in terms of work and the kind of job they're going to do, sometimes vocation has that implication, but more a kind of general outlook into the future. What's my life going to be like? What am I being called to do? That word vocation comes from the Latin word vocare, which means to call, and so a vocation is a calling, which maybe might imply a caller. There's something out there that's drawing me to a particular form of life and a particular kind of work. So that notion inspired the Lilly Endowment to offer some very large grants to a number of colleges and universities around the country, and that program was called PTEV, the Programs for the Theological Exploration of Vocation. Baylor University was one of the institutions that got one of those grants. So was my institution, Hope College. And they took place in the early part of the 2000s. So from around 2001, and most of those grants carried over, and there were some extensions to them, carried over for about 10 years or so. But there was a desire to keep this conversation going after those grants were done, and maybe to expand the repertoire of institutions that might be involved, and that's why NetView was started. A network of colleges that consider vocation to be an interesting topic, something that might expand our understanding of undergraduate education, and something that might be worth giving more attention to. So you can learn more about NetView. There's this website. There are some flyers around, sort of scattered around the conference. And the director of NetView, Shirley Rules, wave your hand, Shirley, is here at the conference also. So if you want to find out a little bit more about it, she will be happy to talk with you about that. It has many initiatives and projects. It offers some grants to member institutions, and it gets people together at conferences, not unlike this one, every other year on a national basis, and between those national conferences on a regional basis. We were just here down the road in San Antonio last February, where it was also 80 degrees, which for a guy from Michigan is a nice thing for it to be in February. So that was good. We talked a lot about the book that I'm going to tell you about in a minute. One of the projects of NetView is something called the NetView Scholarly Resources Project. One of the findings, I suppose you would say, of this project carried out at a lot of institutions across the country was that although everyone seems to have a general idea about what vocation is and why it might matter, there's not just a huge amount of literature on this subject, at least in the way that we talk about the language of vocation now. There's lots of Christian historical literature on the idea of vocation as a calling primarily to ordained ministry in one form or another, or to the religious life, which was the original use of the language. But the kind of broader concept of vocation, and especially as it's employed in the undergraduate educational context, not so much scholarship and resources. So the idea was to gather groups of scholars, 12 or so at a time, who would work with each other, read some common literature, read each other's work, and write a book together, essentially. So we've done that. We've done it a couple of times, and we're getting ready to do it a third time. And that is the work of the Scholarly Resources Project. I'll talk more about that in just a minute. But meanwhile, I want to say that a lot of you may have heard or know a little bit about this because a lot of your schools, a lot of the schools represented here at the conference are members of NetView. And if your school is not a member, Well, why the heck not, really? You ought to think about encouraging your institution to become a member because it is, I think, an important nationwide conversation, and I'll try to convince you of that further this morning. So I think that we can perhaps best get into this conversation by taking up the language that was used by James Davidson Hunter last night. Many of you were at that talk, but I will just recap that he mentioned that there are only a few strategies that seem to be open to Christians or persons of faith of any stripe in the larger sort of cultural context than he was talking specifically about within the academic context. The strategies he talked about, the main three that have happened through history, are resistance. That is, there's something about our particular faith that doesn't fit well with culture, so we're going to resist that culture's tendency. Assimilation. We're going to create some kind of thing where we'll all just get along and surrender some of our own assumptions along the way. Or withdrawal, right? We're going to sort of step outside that world and live in a sort of enclosed religious community, not be bothered by the wider culture. He suggests a fourth alternative, which he calls faithful presence from within. The Christians or other people of faith should consider being themselves and know that they are going to be different in some ways from the larger culture, but not withdraw from it, not assimilate into it, but be within it and be a certain kind of leaven within that culture. And my own suggestion is somewhat like his, although I would put it in a little bit stronger terms. I'm going to call it resourcing. Resourcing could be another alternative for people of faith within the larger culture. What are the resources that our particular faith traditions bring that could help the larger culture, and in our case, the larger culture of higher learning, to do a better job with what that culture itself thinks is important, right? Because I'm quite convinced, as I'm a Christian theologian, I'm quite convinced the Christian church and Christian theology has a lot of resources that could be used by academic institutions today. And one of those is its long history of thinking about this notion of vocation or calling. So I want to think about the idea of resource, of people of faith being resources for the larger culture and for institutions of higher learning, even secular ones. And I'll say a little bit more about how that might be possible. I think in the higher ed setting, Christianity has a history. It has a positive history with regard to having founded universities and having universities at its service. It's been practicing this business of resourcing through much of its history, so it's not a brand new thing. And I thought it was interesting that Professor Hunter last night, in response to a question, suggested that, on a lot of these issues, he said, Christianity, his example of a faith that was doing this kind of work, ought to have been out in front of some of these issues. And what we find ourselves doing so often is catching up to something that's going on in culture. And his suggestion was we ought to be out in front. And that's kind of what I mean by this idea of resourcing. We've got some resources within our faith traditions that we ought to be offering and saying, hey, look at this thing which might actually be helpful in the way you and your colleagues in the, let's say, secular university, or it may be in a church-related institution, are thinking about this thing about which you thought faith or the Christian faith had nothing to do, but we have an idea that it might have something to do with it. And the language of vocation is one of those kinds of things. So here is a way that Christianity, I think, can lead to some degree, can resource, can get out in front of these issues, to use Professor Hunter's language from last night. So back to this notion of vocation. It's an ancient term. It has had a role in Christianity for a very long time. Again, suggested the idea of calling. In the medieval era, the focus was primarily on call to the ministry or religious life. In the Protestant Reformation, it widened its focus to focus on a wide range of stations in life. And so it pulls together some interesting things that are important to Christians' faith life, but also life in the home, life at work, life within larger cultural institutions like the state, and provides a way of bringing those under a single rubric of conversation. And so I think vocation is interesting in that respect. It's also closely related to a lot of categories that I think people who are working in higher learning think might be important, whether they have any faith tradition behind it or not. Some words I've heard here at the conference just over the last day: narrative, habit, virtue, community, discernment, All of these words are very much active in the literature and the growing scholarly literature on vocation. And so if those terms, if we think there's some value in those terms, those particular terms, for thinking about this relationship of faith and higher learning, then I think vocation is one of the places where that will come out. And I think our speakers today will give you a clearer idea of that. It's interesting because it's a concept with a long theological history, but it makes sense to people who are coming at this from a non-theological perspective. Right? That is to say that if you talk to somebody about the idea of a calling, they might not believe in God at all, or even a higher power, but they still have this notion that some of what they feel like they should do in life is not just about some brilliant idea that they had for themselves, but there's something out there that's drawing them to it, right? It might be a need that they see in the world, or it might be other people who are asking them or saying to them, hey, you know, you seem to be really good at this sort of thing. Would you come here and do this, right? So that idea of a call is not foreign, I think, to people who may not be coming at this from a theological perspective. Similarly, I think Christianity itself as a faith has a long tradition here, but I think that this language means something to non-Christians as well, people of other faiths. And that's currently, that question is currently under investigation, and I'll say why in a minute. It's part of our scholarly resources project that we're working on right now. We've used three words to describe the reason that we think vocation kind of works in a higher ed setting. One is that it's capacious. It's a big tent, right? So again, this notion of whether you're theologically interested or not, you might find some space in your life for thinking about vocation. It's dynamic. That is to say, it's not a sort of once and for all kind of thing. I think people go on kind of reflecting on and discerning their vocations throughout their lives. And so it's not one of those things where you just have to sort of go through one little bit of process and then you're set for all time, which is really good because culturally, nobody keeps doing the same thing for very long these days, right? So that sort of dynamic quality of it is important. And as a term, as a concept, it's an elastic word. That is to say, it fits in a lot of different settings. This is why I think secular institutions, as well as church-related ones, have found that this language works. It clicks for their students. A lot of faculty get interested in it. It doesn't quite build up the same level of defensiveness that certain other kinds of language and terms might build up on the part of some readers or listeners. So I think those features of the language of vocation are important and relevant. So the Scholarly Resources Project took on three elements of this larger vocational conversation in order to write three books on the subject. So you'll have to excuse me because I'm dealing with my own very primitive technology here because I put this together at the last minute. And so, let's see, okay. So this book, at this time and in this place, actually exists. It's nice and real. We have a few copies of it here. There are some copies down at the Baylor bookstore if anybody's interested in picking it up. This is the first product of the project. Its focus is mainly on pedagogy. What does it mean to teach in an institution where vocation is a term of art and where we're thinking about how that relates to students? So the chapters in this book deal with the sort of on the ground, in the classroom, and out of the classroom questions that arise in relationship to vocation. I'm not going to say much more about it because all three of our authors who are here today are going to be speaking about their own contributions to it and a little bit more broadly about some of the rest of what's in the book. So that's number one. Number two, which I believe I can pull out here, is this book, Vocation Across the Academy. Our second charge was to think about the way that this language of vocation might work in different subject areas or fields of study. That one does not quite exist yet, and I don't know why it has a big watermark in the middle of it. It doesn't really have that big purple splotch, so you have to imagine it without that. We have a flyer here at the conference that tells you about that, lists the subjects or the topics of the chapter. This book almost exists, just about to send off the subject index. That's the very last thing. So it will be out in January and is also available. Oxford University Press has given us a very nice discount to offer to conference attendees on this book, so I encourage you to take advantage of that. It's better than you'll even get at their Christmas sale, so this is the way to go. Pick up a flyer if you'd like. And then the third book, making good on a promise I made a moment ago, is about the idea of vocation in a multi-faith context. Does this language of vocation, which has pretty strong Christian roots, work in campus settings that are increasingly, where the campus population is increasingly of a large number of faiths and of none. And so the third group of scholars has met for the first time this summer. They've decided what they're going to write. They're writing right now. A couple of them are done. A couple of them will be done soon, and the rest of them I will bug until January, at which point they will all get back together, read each other's work, comment on it, go back, do revisions, and we'll have a third book, the title of which is yet to be determined. So that's the Scholarly Resources Project. That's a little bit about NetView, and that gives you a basic sense of what's going on. We have three distinguished panelists with us today who are going to speak about their own chapters in the book, and perhaps go a little beyond that to tell you a little bit more about the book. I'm going to introduce them all now so that I don't have to keep popping up here to the podium to do that. So we have, first of all, Bill Cavanaugh of DePaul University, whose chapter in the book is called Actually, You Can't Be Anything You Want, and It's a Good Thing Too. And so he's going to talk a little bit about that. Second, we'll have Hannah Schell from Monmouth College in Illinois, whose chapter focuses on virtue, and specifically on virtue that's not usually listed among the classical virtues, and that is that of loyalty, and she's going to speak to that. And then finally, we'll have Doug Henry from here at Baylor, who will speak about the role of narrative and how it's related to the idea of vocation, drawing out of his chapter on that subject as well. They're all three really great, engaging speakers. I'm pleased to be able to call them my good friends as well as colleagues, so I ask you to welcome them to the podium. Thanks very much.
Thanks, David. David wrote that title to my chapter, by the way. I had something boring, and
I'm very proud of it.
David spruced it up. So it comes from this idea that's very prevalent in our society, right? This quote attributed to Abraham Lincoln: "You can be anything you want to be, do anything you set out to accomplish if you hold to that desire with singleness of purpose." And it's not only Abraham Lincoln, but it's Dusty the Animated Airplane and Turbo the Animated Snail and all of this kind of Disney movies, right? You don't have to prepare, you just have to show up and outbelieve your opponents, and you can do whatever you want. And students are marinated in this type of cultural messaging, and I think at some level they find that it just increases their anxiety. One, because it's not true, right? You can't be anything you want. And also because it's really hard to know what you want, right? And that's something that I think is even harder to get at. I used to TA for Stanley Hauerwas when I was a graduate student at Duke, and he used to tell his undergraduate students first day of class, "I don't want you to think for yourselves, I want you to think like me." He said, other professors tell you to make up your own minds, but I don't think you have minds worth making up. And the students would be taken aback by this. But the point is, of course, how do you know what kind of life that you want until you have lived enough to know, right? There's a sense of formation that has to take place before you just give all of these choices to students and say, choose whatever you want. But the ideology of choice is what I'm after in this chapter, and it's an ideology that's everywhere. I just got in my email yesterday a report from my own university's College of Arts and Letters about the core curriculum, and one of the recommendations is that we offer more choices in the core curriculum. Why? Because that's what other schools are doing, right? This is what you call best practices, which usually means what everybody else is doing, right? That's why I always run when I hear the term best practices. So what I try to do in the chapter is try to get underneath what's the economic and social background to this ideology of choice. And so Weber famously linked capitalism and vocation, but I do it in a different way. I basically present capitalism as being this tremendously, it's been called creative destruction, right? And it destroys long-standing customs, traditions, communities, ways of life, and it creates new ways of living. And so it offers us this tremendous variety of choices. It shakes up the world, but it simultaneously strips away the basis on which you would make those choices, right? And that's the kind of paradox, right? More choice, but less basis on which to discern what's the right choice and what's not. So I give a little history of primitive accumulation and the enclosure movement ways in which choice is created by coercion. And then I look at a couple of psychologists, Barry Schwartz and Daniel Gilbert, and show how they've argued that choice is experienced as coercive by people. And so Schwartz begins his book, The Tyranny of Choice, I think is the name of the book. But he talks about walking into a supermarket and seeing 360 varieties of salad dressing and so on. And now we have to choose, our investments and our gender and all, everything now is choice. And he asks the question, why then are we less happy? And gives some statistics showing that we are in fact happy. But the ideology is that more choice, more better, right? And of course, at a certain point, that's true, right? If you are living in a subsistence society and don't have a lot of choices, your life can be better by having more choices. But he argues that at some point, the proliferation of choice it becomes experienced then as something which is not liberating, but rather kind of confining. And he talks about this for several reasons. The time it takes to sort through all the choices that are there is a negative. It increases the stakes of our choices. He makes a distinction that a lot of psychologists make between maximizers and satisficers. A satisficer is somebody who's looking for something, they find it, they stop looking. A maximizer is somebody who's always worried that they haven't checked out all of the choices, right? And so a maximizer might eventually get a better deal on the sweater that they're looking for than a satisficer. But the maximizer is never happy because they can never be satisfied with the choices that they make because they're always worried that there's another choice out there. And then the work of Daniel Gilbert, the Harvard psychologist who appears on Prudential commercials. He's become a little bit of a celebrity, but he's done all of this empirical psychological research on what people want. And he argues that it's not like the Rolling Stones say you can't always get what you want. The problem is you can't always know what you want. And so he talks about various psychological mechanisms that keep us from knowing what we want. He talks about impact bias, which is how we overestimate how happy a new car or a new job or a new house is going to make us. And we can't predict, the problem is that we can't predict that's going to happen no matter how often it happens. And he talks about the empathy gap, that when we're in a cold emotional state, we can't predict how we will behave in a hot emotional state. And so we keep making these bad decisions. Why did I think that working 80 hours a week at a law school was going to, or a law firm was going to make me happy, right? Why did I think that buying a big house isolated, with no neighbors is going to make me happy? That sort of thing. So both of them then talk about the notion of regret. We regret retrospectively decisions that we've made, but there's also what's called anticipated regret, where we regret choices that we haven't even made yet because we're afraid that we were incapable of making the right choice. And so leaving options open is the way we usually want to respond to this, but it often makes regret worse because time and effort and money invested in major choices like college and spouse and children and so on, that's not refundable, right? And also, if a decision is irreversible, we can get on with our lives, right? If we're not thinking, did I marry the right person? Should I dump this person? Then we can get on with things. But if you're always thinking, is this the right spouse for me? Is this the right job? Is this the right car? Then you're constantly being subject to anticipated regret because we're afraid that this was not the best decision that we could have made. So that's a little bit of the background. And then the last part of the chapter, what I try to do is provide some responses and resources. How then can we as educators, especially those of us in religious traditions, what can we give to students besides just a proliferation of choices and more of this, you can be anything you want, choose, and so on. So a few resources for making good choices and then a few resources for accepting the choices that we make. Resources for making good choices, first accepting limits, right? The Genesis story, right? Being a finite creature of a good God is not a problem. right? The problem is when you try to deny your finiteness, and that's when everything goes to hell, right? The Bible is great for a couple chapters, and then the rest of it's kind of messy. Secondly, then, resources for making good choices, developing good habits, right? We have to rely on formation and not just just decisions, right? And being rightly formed frees us up from having to make decisions, right? Things just kind of come naturally. If you're a virtuous person, virtue is a good habit, right? Then the right decision just kind of comes naturally. You don't have to decide every time you walk into a store whether or not you're going to steal something, because it just doesn't occur to you if your habits have been formed well. And Hannah's going to talk more about virtue, so that's all I'll say there. How do you get this kind of formation then? Schwartz and Gilbert are very good at explaining what the problem is, but they never explain why. Why are humans so incapable of knowing what they want? And that's where theological resources, I think, are very helpful. Augustine, I think, is very helpful for this idea that there's a source of truth outside of the self, and the more we are wrapped up in God's will, the freer we become. God is closer to me than I am to myself, and so it's this estrangement from the self, which is simultaneously an estrangement from God, and so kind of intimacy with the source of our being, who is God, is one way then of countering this kind of alienation of not knowing what we want. And then the fourth resource for making good decisions is committing to communities of good people, families, churches, college communities, and so on. We need people, we need other people who love us to limit our choices, right? We need families to kind of limit the places where we can think about living because we want to be close with them. We need others to tell us what we can give to the world, which is a really different question from what do I want, right? What does the world need from me? And we need to be bold enough to tell students, right, you're really good at this, and this is what we need from you, right? This is what the world needs from you, or this is what this community, this is what the church needs from you, this is what the university needs from you. And we need to prepare each other for suffering, right, for running up against limitations, for caring for a special needs child decade after decade. I mean, these are not things that are choices, but things that we need to prepare each other for and support each other in. And we need to make commitments to each other that are not reversible, right? And marriage is one of the prime examples of that. This idea that you would commit yourself to somebody no matter what is going to happen until one of you kicks the bucket. I mean, it's a really silly idea if you believe in the ideology of choice. You always want to keep your options open, right? But this idea of marriage in the Christian tradition, that you commit yourself to somebody no matter what, Schwartz says that actually makes us happier. People are happier in those kinds of relationships. So those are some resources that I talk about for making good choices. And then I finish with talking about resources for accepting the choices that you make. And there, being a satisficer is important, right? You need to accept good enough and not constantly be worrying that you didn't make the best choice. And then finally, narrating your choices as part of God's story. Accepting the life you have by learning to identify retrospectively the path that you did in fact choose as the right one. It may not be true that you can be anything you want to be, but you may find instead that you've become the person that God called you to be, even if you wouldn't have chosen your life out of all the possibilities, right? Even if you could know what the possibilities were, right? Now, we have to be careful with that because this could be taken in a direction of just accepting whatever comes your way, right? You have to stay in an abusive relationship because this is God's will, right? That's not what I'm saying at all, right? In order to be good enough, it has to be good, right? And so that's important. But there's this idea that I pick up from Sam Wells about over-accepting, about turning fate into destiny. And over-accepting is a term that he borrows from theater, where something happens on stage and you kind of write it into a different narrative, even if it's something unexpected. It comes from improvisational theater. And an example he uses is a concert pianist playing the piano, and a child runs up on stage and starts banging on the keyboard, right? You can either have the child removed or just let the child bang on the keyboard, or you could put your hands around the child and weave what the child is doing into another melody that kind of incorporates it. And that's what he calls over-accepting. And so a Christian, I think, seeks to interpret the fog of his or her own imperfect individual decisions through the lens of the much larger story of God's creation and redemption of the world through this community, which is known as Christ's body. And so we're relieved then of this terrifying burden of imagining that we alone are responsible for our fates and that we need to make the best possible choices in order for our lives to come out right. Right? So there's an idea that God is in charge that I think helps us relax a little bit. Thank you.
I wanted to begin by thanking David for this chance to talk about the book and the particular essays. So my essay was a part of the book that focuses on the connection between vocation and virtues. And what was kind of hinted at in David's comments, but I guess I want to highlight because I think it's really one of the positive things about these books, is that they are collections of essays with an editor, but the essays were produced through deep conversations spread out over a couple of years. Very well facilitated by David Cunningham. And so we had some shared readings, and we met initially, and we started brainstorming and started to try and begin to see some patterns in what we were thinking about. And David helped us sort of begin to give shape to that. Then we went away and sort of wrote rough drafts, came back together, shared them. And so these collections of essays really come out of conversations with each other. And so if you read them as a whole, you can pick up on that. And what emerged rather early in our conversations is a deep sense of the overlap between vocation and virtue, and that's really not surprising. David mentioned some of the particular points there: narrative and habit, what it means to be formed, to do that in community, to be thinking about that over the long arc of a life. So a portion of this book, 3 essays, are focused on virtue. So first, of course, there are the virtues that become important as anyone, but I'm thinking specifically about undergraduates, begin to engage in this difficult process. And Paul Waddell beautifully writes about this. He mentions, well, first there's the importance of justice and faithfulness, in part because you do this work in connection with other important people in your life, and so the quality of your relationships with them matters. Courage, the process of vocational discernment absolutely takes a lot of courage and risk. I see heads nodding. Patience, definitely, to realize you're not going to figure it out once and that you can have sort of twists and turns and moments of disappointment. But actually, the essays in this book that talk about the connection between virtue and vocation kind of come at it from a different way. I would say sort of a deeper connection, and it's what David in the introduction to this section sort of identifies that vocation work really is ultimately a moral enterprise. It is absolutely wrapped up with the forming of the characters of young men and women, and sort of what they're going to do in their life is a part of that. And so these essays, I think, each in their own way, highlight that. So the specific virtues that get sort of addressed in this section are first Paul Waddell's essay on what it means to be called to a magnanimous way of life. And so he talks about that as that the work of vocation is, and these are his words, characterized by a willingness to move beyond self-centeredness and to live for something greater than ourselves. Actually, I love that sentence. That this is a process of cultivating a greatness of soul, and that 2 specific things are key to that. And fortunately, I think they're elements that our students at least have a glimpse of or a sense of, and we can help them understand that in a deeper way. The first one is the virtue of hope, and then the second is the practice of friendship, are both central to cultivating greatness of soul. And he quotes there, Christians among the virtues, because as we all know, good people help keep each other good. Then in the second essay in this section, Tal Howard of Gordon College talks about the virtue of prudence, and he draws on his experience taking students to Europe and actually looking at visual representations of the virtues, with prudence often being described as the eye of the soul. And so the title of his essay he gives, Seeing with All Three Eyes. Now, prudence is a virtue that is often misunderstood, parodied, kind of mischaracterized in our contemporary culture. We sometimes see it as caution or even small-mindedness, Tal says, and he reminds us that there was a sort of cringeworthy caricature you may remember by Saturday Night Live and the parody of former President Herbert Walker Bush when he talked about the importance of prudence. So unfortunately, that may be what our students think of when they hear the term. But seeing with the eye of the soul, prudence enables a person to live a self-directed life that seeks integration. Tal focuses specifically on two aspects of prudence that are especially relevant when working with undergraduates: the importance of teachableness, the disposition of a mind that seeks out and recognizes reliable authorities, and then second, the importance of accurate memory, the ability to remember what is true to the reality of the past. And Paul's essay, I think, can be described as kind of in keeping with his other writing. It really offers a rich and deep sense of Aristotle's approach to the virtues, and I think actually is an essay that you could put in the hands of undergraduates and that they would find quite helpful and inspiring. Tal's essay absolutely gives some background on tracing back to Aristotle through Aquinas, the medieval background, and again, these visual depictions. Okay, now my own essay, I'm going to take a different tact for a couple of reasons. I selected to focus on the virtue of loyalty, and this is because loyalty is something that I have thought about for a long time. Many, many years ago, I wrote a dissertation on the American philosopher Josiah Royce and his philosophy of loyalty. He wrote that in 1908. And as I've engaged in work with undergraduates on vocation, at Monmouth we use the language of discerning lives of meaning and purpose, I have found that the language of loyalty and some of the insights of Royce, writing many years ago, actually pertain. They sort of are things that resonate with my students, not all of whom identify as Christian. And so one of the points I want to make is that this vocational work I think is absolutely influenced, of course, by your institutional context, and then definitely by the student who's sitting in front of you, who you're doing the mentoring work with, and we have to take that seriously. So part of why I think the language of loyalty can be used and is helpful when we're thinking about vocation is that it's something that our students understand as a part of their life. When you start talking to them about what's important to them, they describe their commitments and their participation in athletics. They think my students are certainly very oriented to their families. They might talk about their participation in fraternities and sororities. Some students might begin to talk about their major and their department as a place where they belong. So they understand what loyalty is. They understand that it's fragile. They understand betrayal. And so using that language to get them to begin to think about who they are, where they stand now, what's important to them, and sort of what's underneath that and what that might mean about, and this is Royce's language, sort of the larger causes about which they might want to orient their life, I have found to be very helpful. And it's a non-theological language that is not antithetical to theological commitments. And so for some students, part of that conversation, what's revealed is that their religious identity and commitments is an important part of who they am. And I think the language of loyalty is capacious enough to make place for that. So in my essay, how much time do I have?
Halfway.
Okay,
So-
good. In the essay, I sort of focus on four, I think I called them conundrums, but I'm still not happy with that word. They're areas that I see as fraught. They're sort of sensitive areas that come up again and again in my work with undergraduates, but that I believe this language of loyalty and thinking in terms of community and commitments can actually address. And so let me say a little bit about what those areas are. The first one is what I call, following Charles Taylor, the problem of expressivism. Our students often understand their calling as first and foremost a matter of finding themselves. And once they achieve that imagined goal, they believe they can live out lives in which they are being true to themselves. And this is something that the Leading Lives That Matter collection highlights actually beautifully right in the beginning, that this language of the self and as of expressivism has been one of the dominant languages that we frequently use for calling and vocation. But if their vocation stems from their identity and their ability to express that identity, and those identities are in flux, how could they possibly know what they are called to do? And this picks up on some of what Bill was just talking about. Now, one of the things that I think is helpful about Royce is he actually had a fairly advanced view of the self. Royce was very attuned to developments in sociology among European sociologists, and so he wrote about the self as being inherently dynamic, as a process in time, and as relational. One of his students was George Herbert Mead, and so there's kind of a trajectory here. And so because of that, Royce in his writings is actually very attuned to this issue of how identity, although he wouldn't have used that word, and sort of figuring out what cause you might be loyal to are connected to each other. So identity and vocation are indeed intertwined, but young adults are mistaken when they imagine that they must first sort out the former, who am I, before engaging the latter, what am I called to do? One's calling and purpose and the ways these are expressed in a life are integrally related to the question of identity, but it's only by setting about the task, the work of fulfilling our purpose and being oriented toward this larger project that we even become a self. And so there's several places in the philosophy of loyalty where Royce talks about what it means to begin to engage in this project of becoming a self, and that's always in community with other people. So in terms of the process of the work that we do with young adults, I think we have to help them begin from where they are, to identify those communities of which they're a part and which inform who they are, the causes to which they're already committed, and then to help them begin to think about, whether underlying, if you prefer that metaphor, or overarching loyalties that already give their lives meaning. And giving them opportunities to make those explicit and reflect upon them becomes an important starting point for vocational discernment. It helps them to see that they're embedded already in webs of relationship and meaning, and helps, I think, get them to move beyond just expressions of sort of the self. This is a phrase I learned from my students last spring when I was teaching a course on Christian vocation. When we were reading some of the essays in Leading Lives That Matter, they said, oh, we understand what you're talking about, Professor Schell. It's that idea that, like, wait, I gotta get it. You be you, or you do you. So it's an abuse of the English language, among other problems, but this is how they think. And so if you can sort of draw that out, make that explicit, and then begin to hint at why that it might be more than that, there's good work to do. So the second issue is what Royce called the paradox of inner and outer authority. So our students believe, because they believe that discerning vocation is a matter of self-expression, they are wary. There's actually other reasons why they are too, but in this particular case, they're wary of authorities telling them what to do, even as they crave and need input and guidance. And this issue is actually addressed head on in Leading Lives That Matter in a section called To Whom Should I Listen? A really great set of essays there, and I recommend it if you want to work on this issue with your students. And this was a paradox, as Royce understood it, because we do, as sort of a Kantian, Royce thought, there is an important need for autonomy, but it can't just be on its own. It's always got to be with input from others. This is related to that sort of becoming a self. And the way Royce talks about this is a process of coming to know our own will, and that's always requires help from other people. And so as mentors, we can help students begin to think about what's important to them and sort of address this paradox of inner and outer authority. I see that I only have a few minutes left. So I'll just quickly say and I'll wrap up. The third point that I try and address is their need for a sense of belonging, and I talk about Sharon Delos Park's writings on the importance of mentoring communities. I have some additional thoughts on that, actually, since I wrote this essay about when that's appropriate to talk about with students and when it's maybe not relevant. And if those come out in Q&A, I'm happy to say a little bit more. The fourth kind of area that's fraught is, and in some ways this already came up, is I think this work of vocation is important to do with students. One, to help them realize you don't just sort of settle it once and for all, but if we can begin to help them have a sense of what their life is about, that it's connected to something beyond themselves, that then serves them well for the inevitable moments of crisis, setback, dissolution of relationships, loss of a job, illness, these sorts of things. I think that they are better prepared for those if they have an understanding of themselves as connected to communities, having fundamental commitments, and having a sense of their life being connected to something larger than just their own success. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Well, thanks, colleagues. It was a great pleasure working with the likes of David and Hannah and Bill and others, and it's good to be with you all here today. Thanks for joining us at Baylor. The essay that I contributed to the book explores a set of questions. Within what kinds of life stories does the very idea of vocation make sense? Which kinds of large-level narratives does our culture induct students into? Do some narratives render the idea of a calling implausible or perhaps even inconceivable? And a series of questions that grow out of those. All of those questions deserve a longer conversation, plainly, than we have here today. I'm really going to make 3 points and share 3 quick stories. First point, our stories matter. We want life to make sense, or students want their lives to make sense, to count for something. We want the right story to tell of our lives, don't we? The one that makes sense of our desires and aspirations, our victories, our defeats, our failures. Second point, we have work to do in learning our stories. We don't simply choose lives for ourselves, as Bill's point. As much as we may be encouraged to do so, that's simply not the way it works. We receive lives, the promise of which is due to many things outside of our control. We're born into families, communities, and faiths that precede us. We're given a story before responsible co-authorship of our stories begins. So it's right, it seems to me, for us to question our stories, the ones we're given, to ask if we can fulfill the roles that we've inherited, to wonder if our characters will hold up under duress. That's work. That's hard work. And it's not surprising that students find it challenging under the best of circumstances. Third point, American higher education shapes our students' life narratives. Think of the ways that we communicate what's valuable and what's not. We invite students to own, to claim, to identify with particular stories through the degrees that we offer and promote, and the ones we don't. We bring students into a larger story of identity through the curricula that we require or make optional. Pick whatever you want, it doesn't matter. When we honor alumni, we give pride of place to particular framing narratives, some of which count more than others. Fortune 500 CEO, elementary school teacher. Through the traditions we sustain, through the media releases that we write or somebody in our institution writes, we invite students to live out certain stories rather than others. So by default or design, maybe sometimes, we teach students what matters, where success lies, what a good life story looks like, and which vocations are honorable. Now, let me share with you 3 stories on offer in American higher education. And I'm going to do all too concisely here and suggestively what I spend a little more time in the book chapter unfolding. What I want to do is to take you to an allos tropos, to another place where we can see afresh the power of the stories that we overlook too often in the haunted, not haunted ivory tower, in the familiar haunts of the ivory tower. But maybe the ivory tower is haunted too. Depends on which story we're telling, doesn't it? What I mean to say is that I'm going to borrow my stories from novels, because doing so, going to that other place, can sometimes reveal or show to us narratives that we need to notice, but we don't because things are just so familiar in the here and now. So indulge me as I borrow from imaginative works to show you part of the narrative that I think is told by American higher education. The first is a story of presumption. Welshman Ken Follett's popular novel, Pillars of the Earth, traces the lines on which life, longing, and love are built. Few characters in this novel rival the Cathedral of Kingsbridge. In and around the cathedral, the story unfolds. For it, lands are won and lost, and lives saved and destroyed. Pillars shows the transformation of Kingsbridge, a sleepy priory at the beginning, into a thriving cathedral city by the end. Cathedral builders contribute to the city's initial prosperity, and savvy leaders ensure its vitality. It's made profitable through the licensing of a wool market that enables thriving trade, made fit for culture through savvy urban planning, we might call it today, protected from the plague through medicine and practices of quarantine. The fortunes of the cathedral and the city are at the heart of the book. People live and die, kings rise and fall, generations come and go, but monumental feats of culture like cathedrals and cities last forever. Or do they? Pillars expresses a way of life appropriately named presumption. Really bad things happen. Raping, pillaging, murdering, lying, cursing, thieving, usurping. Still, we witness the progress of a world controlled through human ingenuity and technology. Cathedrals are beautiful or spacious, safe when architects think imaginatively and learn from past mistakes. Trade becomes profitable when markets are open, centrally located, operated under law. Urban life is better when good roads and bridges are built with fairly collected taxes. Fewer people die of disease through hygienic precautions, records kept of treatments, what works and what doesn't work. The book encourages confidence that thought transformed into action solves problems. Follett inscribes into this lovely novel, which you should read if you haven't, a story broadly influential in our age. It's a technophilic fantasy, one of the most alluring, pervasive, and vain narratives of our age. Many examples beckon. We could all pull our smartphones out and duel with one another to see what we could do more quickly and efficiently and superior to one another. Tony Kronman observes, we live in a world in which all we can imagine is more technology, new and better gadgets that permit us to do what we want at greater speed and lower cost. That is, for today, he says, the only imaginable future, and we embrace it both because we want it and because we believe it's inevitable. We find ourselves gripped in a narrative that emphasizes know-how. Worse, we sometimes induct students into that narrative in our institutions through exuberant, uncritical accounts, especially of the natural and applied sciences. But let me go on to insist immediately that presumptuous confidence in technique can afflict any field. Economics, law, education, the social sciences are liable, even if we think maybe most immediately about computer scientists, engineers, and biomedical researchers. Technophilia is a problem that we are complicit in as well. And when we induct students into presumptuous narratives of this sort, in which technology allegedly solves all problems, we ill prepare them for callings responsive to the human soul's deep needs, in which we cannot banish all tragedy, in which suffering is inevitable and we have to come to terms with it. My second story is of despair, from presumption, the opposite end. And here I turn to A Game of Thrones, George Martin's fantasy epic now totaling 5 books and 2 million words. The book's dominant themes are death and power. Death is implacable, but power gives one a say over the conditions of one's death. If you're poor, oppressed, weak, the small folk, as the books call them, as likely as not, you'll suffer horribly and die early. The rich, powerful, and strong, well, they die too, but at least they don't suffer as much. They choose how they die, unless they play the Game of Thrones poorly, and then they too may suffer and die horribly. One reviewer describes the thematic arc of these stories as pretty basic. Violence, rape, devastation, repeat, sprinkle in some dragons and frozen zombies. It's about right. Despair distinguishes a Game of Thrones. The powerful relentlessly grind human lives into oblivion. We see in it a cynic's bleak, relentless, scoffing despair. Despair transforms life into Shakespeare's tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Martin, however, says his books are merely realistic. One of his reviewers writes, "It's an epic for a more profane, more jaded, more ambivalent age than the one Tolkien lived in." Tolkien wrote at a time when it really seemed as if a war was on for the fate of civilization. Now we're not even sure what civilization is. Martin's despair has sold millions of books because it matches the despair of our age. We live in an age, I submit to you, that careens between presumption and despair. Especially in academe, despair could be a popular way to demonstrate one's sophistication. It's a common pose, isn't it? Partly understandable in its reaction against the sentimental schlock and feckless fantasy of those with easy solutions to intractable problems. Despair, we have to acknowledge, often begins by making a genuine outcry in the face of plenty of real darkness in the world. That we should acknowledge. Despair, however, then gives up. It can be the mode of worn-out, cynical teachers whose despairing critical theory reduces everything to shifting lines of power beneath which lies nothing more than self-interest. Despair can be the framing narrative implicitly at work in pre-law or marketing programs in which students find themselves learning skills of manipulating others for personal gain as they participate in their own Game of Thrones. And despair can be a rock on which our institutions founder when the ennobling vocation of learning and service to beauty, truth, and goodness is overrun by the alleged demands of markets, of accreditors, or government. Game of Thrones is not a fit story for us or our students to inhabit, not as people made in the image of God. We're called to a greatness nowhere in view in Martin's stories. Here, I think we do well to heed Benedict XVI's reminder, we were created for greatness, for God himself, but our heart is too small for the greatness to which it's destined. It must be stretched. Third story. It's a story of hope. My colleague Ralph Wood notes that in 3 different polls, British readers declared Lord of the Rings the most important book of the 20th century. Brits are pretty proud of this accomplishment indeed. At the heart of Lord of the Rings lies hope. In hope, we recognize ourselves as pilgrims walking an arduous path toward a future we cannot see. In God's good gift of hope, we become saintly heroes whose success is worth expending our lives in imitation of Christ. By the grace of hope, we can live without present vindication because we know God's promises for our future aren't empty. And education into hope is at work in Tolkien's books, because after all, upon Frodo and Sam's successful quest, Middle-earth's fortunes hang. They're joined by 7 other pilgrims in a grim venture to rid their world of the Ring of Power. Hope transforms their capacity to live out a story beyond anything resembling their initial capacity. It provides an alternative way forward for a fellowship of friends that's tempted by both presumption and despair. And we see the best instance of this in the books during the Council of Elrond. Having learned of the ring's terrible power, Boromir argues for its use. He wants to go put down the opposition. Let the ring be your weapon. Take it and go forth to victory, he says. Boromir's trust in the power of artifacts under the direction of well-intended, powerful men makes him an emblem of presumption. In valor and strength, he pledges the bold men of Gondor to subdue a fearsome threat through power, stratagem, and art. Yet neither Elrond nor Gandalf concede. We cannot use the ruling ring, Elrond says. He sees it as fashioned out of wickedness, as an emblem of the tyrannical consolidation of power that arrogantly trods underfoot everything in its way, and as a dangerous temptation, even in the hands of the good, to exceed the proper limits of our creatureliness, to be as gods, as it were. On the other hand, Eristor, chief counselor to Elrond, gives voice to despair. What strength have we for finding the fire in which it was made? That is the path of despair, he says. Why try? Failure's inevitable. We can't possibly do this. Yet Gandalf replies, it is not despair, for despair is only for those who see the end beyond all doubt. We do not. Tolkien shows us what magnanimity looks like, the greatness of soul that aspires to great deeds and worthy goals and does not shrink from difficult tasks, the material of Paul Waddell's chapter in our book. Listening to all that's said in the scene is a young hobbit of pliable character. He's heard the impassioned cases of those who would presume and those who would despair. He's heard the counsel of the great and witnessed what they will and won't do. He's heard stories that shape his emerging sense of calling. I will take the ring, he says, though I do not know the way. Therein, colleagues, is the embodiment of humble, magnanimous hope, a framing narrative in which it's possible to conceive of being called to something, even not knowing fully what that entails, and having the wherewithal, the greatness of soul, and the humility to undertake it. Frodo becomes a very small but very significant pilgrim walking a difficult path that simultaneously requires his self-sacrifice and underwrites his self-fulfillment. And that is the heart of vocation as Christians conceive it. Our colleague Paul Waddell reminds us, and I'll close with this line, if Christianity does anything, it locates one's life within a story. It tells us who we are by telling us where we stand. He also diagnoses a difficulty we face. One reason, Paul writes, many students have little idea of what they think is good is that they do not picture themselves standing within a story that helps them make sense of their place in the world. Colleagues, here is hopeful work for us to undertake. This, I submit, is what higher learning is all about, to teach students, both through what we implicitly and explicitly offer in the university, what it means to find ourselves in a narrative of which we have an important part, in which we have an important part, and in which we can find our calling. Thanks.
So we want to take some time to ask for your questions. I'll just do three very quick things before we do that. One is to say that there are four major parts of the book. You've heard from speakers from three of the four parts, and you can do some extrapolation and figure out some of the other issues that might be covered in those parts. The fourth part of the book is about vocational discernment beyond the classroom setting. So there's a chapter on community engagement, there's a chapter on co-curricular activities, there's a chapter on the physical space of the campus and how that might encourage or discourage vocational reflection and discernment. Also really interesting material in there, and I commend it to you. A second thing is to say that we've found that the metaphor of vocabulary is a very useful one for thinking about this idea of vocation. We're not trying to suggest that it's a great new ontological reality that sits there, or even that it's just a sort of very practical kind of item to have in your toolbox. It's a new vocabulary for higher education, and we actually use that as the subtitle for the forthcoming book on the disciplines. We feel like it's something that can give people in different disciplines at different kinds of institutions and with different theological and political and ideological commitments a kind of common language to speak about some issues that are, I think, important to all of them. And then finally, we have some resources available for you for further investigation into all of this. I'm going to put them up on the screen as soon as I can figure out how to get the projector back on. We have a Twitter feed. We have I can direct you to the NetView website, and we also have a public blog called vocationmatters.org, where we post some ongoing reflections on this, mostly from scholars who have contributed to these books. So I hope you'll join the conversation through all those possibilities. But you have the opportunity to do that right now because we have quite a bit of time available for your questions, comments, thoughts, reactions. Encourage those at this point. Yes, right here.
Thank you, Matt, so much for the beautiful presentation. It's really applicable to my work. I work with nursing students here at Baylor. So my question is, it seems like in recent years, students are less able to cope with when they're not successful at a vocation. You know, they feel that nursing is their calling, and those are the type of students we want. And they commit 2 years, you know, with their prereqs, and then a year into the program, no matter how much remediation, they're not able to be successful in the program. And I've had even 2 years in a row where students were in such despair that this wasn't going to be their vocation that they checked themselves into a psychiatric hospital. And I just see more and more that they have less coping strategies. And so do you have recommendations on, I mean, we do things like try to find another vocation that all of their coursework wouldn't be, wasted on, but sometimes really maybe that's even not the best strategy. I'm sure you've kind of faced some of this in your work.
Hmm.
I think we do have to be careful not to have the language of vocation get pinned to job and then a particular job. That doesn't serve them. I mean, this is one major reason. So I guess the way I think about this is that, you've got a group of students who probably already have a pretty strong sense of calling, that it would be important to always talk about that with reference to what I think of as like the underlying commitments, if it's a matter of helping people or relating to the families or ideas of sort of sickness and health or the community. I mean, because that could, whatever that is that's called them to want to be a nurse, probably could be understood in different ways. And I guess my hope is that if they have a sense of that, and if a program gives them a vocabulary for that, that then when it does sort of break down, they can go back to that, sort of say, oh, there's other ways that I can sort of pursue this thing that I feel called to do. It's not all the eggs in that one basket, but that's just my thought on this.
Oh, that's very good. I think we would want to be careful, and are careful in the book, to distinguish vocation and career. Mm-hmm. Called to be daughters and sons, husbands and wives, neighbors and friends, called to compassion, called to care. Mm-hmm. And there are a variety of ways that those things might be given expression as one, abides in faith, hope, and charity. And nursing is a beautiful, honorable, and demanding way of doing that, but it's not the only way. But even when it is the way, and everybody has, nothing but straight A's and great successes and clinicals and everything's great, I think it's important to remember that one's vocation is larger than just that professional expertise.
It might help as well to make it clear at the outset that some of you are not going to make it, and this goes against most of the messaging that they hear, right? They always hear that they've been given their participation trophies ever since they were little, and marketing, of course, of universities makes it sound as if you can do anything you want if you come to our school. And so it's not the bar is not set very high in terms of expectations. There's this idea that as long as you work hard at this, you can succeed, and some people can't, and it's just not true, right? And so making that clear, I think at the beginning might be very helpful. That what we're offering here is an opportunity, and we'll help you as much as we can. But this is nursing is serious business, and this is a high bar to get over, and we're not going to dumb that down, and we're not going to lie to you about that. And so I think that might be helpful.
I'll also just mention very briefly a couple of chapters in the forthcoming book would be of great interest to you. One's by a doctor who teaches at medical school. She says that fully half the students who start at UVA think they're going to be doctors. You can imagine that not quite that many end up being doctors. And so they also have to grapple with this distinction between not being called to a job, being a doctor, but being called to certain kinds of interactions with the world for which there might be very many careers that you could do, and some things that are not careers at all. And so she's got some great reflections on that. And the other is by an engineer who talks about the general category of what he calls undergraduate professional degree programs, of which nursing is one, things where you're ready to go right into the field as soon as you're done with your undergraduate work, for the most part. Engineering is one of those also. And he's got some interesting reflections on that and how to kind of broaden or reshape some of those undergraduate professional degree programs, both on a large scale but also on a small sort of nuts and bolts scale that individual instructors might be able to do to make it not, again, to sort of decouple this notion of it's the job that I'm after, as opposed to a larger kind of view of the world. So commend those to you as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, it was a great question. And one that I think applies way beyond nursing, right? I think I see a lot of heads nodding in the room. There are a lot of those cases. Yeah, back and back.
Hi, Simon Oliver from Durham University. I'll try and cram 3 questions into one if I may, so I make the most of the time. Firstly, I mean, with respect to a lot of the comments Bill was making, do you talk the language of gift at all explicitly in any of the essays in the book? And I wonder whether that could be useful and important, taking it back from the notion that gifted people are people with extraordinary and very, very unusual talents, that we're all gifted, and and then you can talk the language of Mos, and the gift bears something of the giver to the recipient. It makes a moral claim on us, but it's not simply that you're the receiver of a gifted life, that your life, in order to remain, must be passed on. So in what sense is your life then a gift onto others? I guess that was the first question. The second is, I think Doug's notion of narrative is really helpful, because a lot of the students I deal with just think that their lives are the result of a whole set of accidents. They have no sense of providence at all. And what we're really talking about in narrative is the exercise that Augustine embarked on in the Confessions, which is learning to read your life. And one of the exercises we go through in the Church of England with people discerning a priestly vocation is to write out a sort of 5-6 page biography and say, look, where are the signs? Where's the providence that's led you to this moment? Because vocation, it's not like a nature grace split. It doesn't suddenly arrive when you're 21. Yes, identities are really in flux at a very young age, but the trajectory and God's guidance can be discerned right from the moment of your conception. The third and final comment is simply about nursing. In the UK, the description of nursing as a vocation has become quite controversial, because nurses say that that's an excuse for underpaying them. And I mean, one could say the same for clergy as well. But it's a term that for us culturally has got to be recovered, because nurses don't like it actually. Anyway, thank you.
Bill actually talks about Augustine's Confessions in that chapter, so I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. I just say amen to that. I think the idea of gift really works against the ideology of choice, and I think that's really helpful. And the idea that gift involves you in this economy of giving and receiving, and you need to think of yourself as being engaged in one of those networks. So thank you. That's a great comment.
Yeah, likewise about narrative here. So a couple of things in the book chapter come into view. The first is that students arrive at our universities at a particularly apt time to think about the stories of their lives. So what happens, first day of orientation? Well, name, rank, serial number. What's your name? Where are you from? What are you majoring in? What do you hope to do? I mean, there is a micro-narrative compacted into 3 or 4 sentences that they begin rehearsing. Now, that micro-narrative may not get at the really important things of their lives, but they doubtless, those who are already reflective and those who can be pushed toward reflectiveness can start wondering, well, how did I get to where I am now? And do I really want to go where I see myself pointing? One of the ways that we can hinder that process, I think, is by, with insufficient self-criticism as faculty and staff and institutions, mirroring the large level narratives that they bring with them from the wider culture. And that's why I was interested in what popular literature does. And we could pick other examples and movies and all sorts of other ways, but that question was curious to me. What large level narratives sort of orient them to how they are in the world? And too often our institutions simply reflect those back to them in our own sophisticated academic ways, no doubt. So we can be an impediment there on the one hand. On the other hand, I end the chapter in the book reflecting on some particular practical and pedagogical things that one may do, which is pressing students to write more expansively a self-narrative, not just the name, rank, serial number version of it, and to read narratives of others who can challenge, on the one hand, their unthought-through assumptions about their own lives and exemplify them the best sort of life. And I think Augustine's Confessions makes my list there too, right? Because he doesn't merely rehearse the narrative of his own life, he sees that the chapter of which his life is a part makes no sense apart from in the beginning God created, right? I mean, so we end up with this odd commentary on Genesis. But it's not odd insofar as he realizes my life makes no sense, has no trajectory, is unintelligible apart from how I see it in the sweep of the cosmic story, the Logos Divine. And so whether it's Augustine's Confessions or any number of other thoughtful personal narratives, I think that helps students see, well, my life might look like that, if not in the details, at least in the overall sweep.
Good. I'm also concerned about this question of the redefinition of vocation, the one that you described as a problem. Vocations are the, quote, helping professions, in other words, the ones we don't pay. There's a good chapter in the next book on work and the kind of way in which we've used work, paid work, unpaid work, etc., that sort of addresses some of those issues. And we have a different vocabulary problem in the U.S., which is vocational education. To some people still means trade school. And so that's another sort of distinction that we're trying to kind of make all the time. Right in the back.
Tim Muldoon from Boston College. Very helpful. Thank you for your presentation. I want to piggyback on Simon's question, first with an observation and then a question. Observation, I recommend David Brooks' most recent book, The Road to Character, on this point of narrative. We assigned it as the freshman convocation book, so all of our first-year students read this last year. It's a compilation of narratives that in his mind, are narratives of character, developing the great soul that you talked about. What he said when he came to our campus, he talked about this. He uses the term the summoned life, which to me is a very nice synonym, for vocation, the summoned life. And he said that in his course at Yale, the story that attracted students the most of the, I believe, dozen that are told in this book was that of Dorothy Day. That half of his students of the entire class wrote about Dorothy Day as a story that was particularly compelling. For him, it seemed to suggest that there was something in that story of being summoned that was so connected to the transcendent question. So Dorothy Day, the founders of the Catholic Worker, this meeting of social justice and profound meditation, prayer. Students found that compelling. So the question that comes out of this observation is this. I wonder what you're finding, the four of you, and whoever wants to answer this, in terms of the meeting point between, let's call it the expected takeaway when thinking about vocation among students, let's say, because again, they're going to think of it in those, I think, professional terms primarily. So there's going to be almost a desire, not a desire to collapse the term, but the term gets collapsed in what they anticipate vocation means, because they're going to think about their jobs. So that on the one hand, versus on the other hand, what we in a Christian tradition would want to think about in a much more transcendent frame, that God does call us, this constant reframing of the narrative, that there is something greater, there is something providential. Where you see the rubbing points, and maybe positively where you see the opportunity, so that it doesn't get collapsed into my job and terrible at not getting the job that I want.
I guess
So, go ahead, David.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, David Brooks' book has a lot to offer. I had a similar experience teaching a group of honors program students here at Baylor, Dorothy Day's chapter, when we spent an evening talking about it in the context of the book, and they loved it. They rallied around it. I brought in some videos of her being interviewed, which was a wonderful thing too. Here's not just ink on a page, but here's the face, here's the voice, here's the, you can get the sense that she's a firebrand reading her stuff, but in her aged years, she very peaceable, very tranquil. She knew who she was and didn't have to be showy or flashy. And they appreciated, I think, seeing something of the larger life that her work fits into. My first move here would be recourse in the vocabulary of hope, the theological virtue of hope, which is not presumptuous precisely because it does not define an end that we have figured out, right? There is Dante's line, hope is a certain expectation of a future glory. So it's a deferred accomplishment, one that we do not secure for ourselves, but which we receive as the gift of God. And hence it's something that we have to wait on and maybe suffer on the way to. But also like your reference to the summoned life, it has some of that cast to it as well. And I think maybe Brooks gets that from William Perkins, but I don't remember that detail.
On your question, I would say that I think that is a natural tendency among students, but that's always been there. That's the kind of question that they've asked in career services offices and so on. And I think at least in our experience, what has happened as this language of vocation has become more prominent, I'll just talk about our own campus for a moment, is that students still go to the career services, but the career services people help them make the connection between what they're thinking about doing and the larger aspects of their life. And there are a lot of people in the classroom, in first-year seminars, in various fields, in introduction to the major kinds of classes in various fields and so on, where faculty are pushing them on exactly those questions that you're saying. Like, okay, you've decided that you want to do this profession, but have you thought about this question, and this question, and this question beyond that? And so I think two key factors here are in solving the problem that you're pointing to, getting enough classroom teachers involved in the question, because they're going to automatically think that other things are important besides what job you're going to do. That's one. And also getting career services places at campuses involved in the vocation conversation so that they don't allow students to trim it down into just what's my job going to be, because that's a natural tendency.
And I mean, part of the problem is that the students don't really want to do that, but I mean, in some ways we push them into that, and there's pressures. You know, the cost of college education, of course, makes the idea that you have to get a job to repay these loans much more urgent. And oftentimes in the liberal arts, too, we spend a lot of effort saying, you know, you can get a job if you major in history or theology or something like that. And we try to kind of push that notion as well, which has its place, but sometimes it pushes it too much. But I really don't think that the students want to make that exclusive identification of vocation with job, because you can really see the way they relax when you broaden the notion of vocation. That they get into this anxiety of seeing their entire worth as a human being connected to a job, and when you tell them that it's not, that they are more than their job, I really think that you can see students relax and open up a little bit. So I really don't think it's something that they want to do, and therefore they don't really. It's not that hard a sell, I think, to open them up to that.
Right here.
So I've been thinking I guess the question that I have, and then I'll have some comments for the context of the question. The question is how to help students negotiate when they are on a path toward figuring out what the vocation is, and perhaps a career that goes along with that, but negotiating the discomfort and pain that is perhaps a part of the story that calls them in a particular way, or as part of the formation of being a part of a particular career. So some of the context for that is the story element that Doug was talking about is very important, very helpful to me. And I wonder about some of the ways in which the stories, not just from the popular culture, but perhaps that are privileged within the church, provide sometimes an impediment, perhaps. I'm thinking about success narratives that are so much a part of what I see in churches on Sunday mornings. Once was lost, but now am found, right? Even though I am a wretch, right? But now found for good, right? That sort of trajectory toward I'm okay now. And I wonder about that in the context of the image of Stanley Hauerwas, sort of having this, exercising this really interesting and I think important function of the shaping and formative power of joining a discipline, right? We have that word discipline. Disciplines are painful, right? They are rigorous. We talk about spiritual disciplines. We talk about knowledge-based disciplines, expertise-based disciplines. And being shaped is a painful process sometimes. And we're thinking about Vygotsky, the zone of proximal development, that sort of educational theory that says, here's where you are, here's where you need to be, and there's the space between. And negotiating that space between where we are and where we want to become isn't always comfortable. And what is the sort of work or the strategies or the conversations around, it's not just that this isn't what's for you, but how do we figure out what the tools are that help them along the way?
I'd start by suggesting we tell better stories, by which I mean more honest, true stories. So institutionally, what would it look like if public relations in writing for our institutional magazines told stories of suffering, sorrow, heartbreak, and grief, maybe which are not fully resolved, but in which important questions are raised, and that wrestling is laid bare for others to see. Probably that's not going to happen, not at Baylor.
Not in this place.
I think at our best, our churches are places where those stories are rehearsed, whether they're biblical figures whose lives are wrecks, but redeemed nonetheless, sometimes in surprising and unexpected ways, in the lives of saints. I mean, which saint had everything straight from day one, and so I think those stories can be told. I teach a class occasionally. It's a great books of confession and autobiography. We start with Augustine's Confessions and end typically with Merton's Seven-Story Mountain. That's not a solution for everybody to go and read Merton, but, well, maybe it is. That would be my... Now, that's not to say here's a list of resources or strategies, but I guess I'm not ready to answer the question quite that way. I think we need imaginative spaces to inhabit, and maybe not quite so single-mindedly looking toward solutions for us at first blush. We need to live in those spaces first.
Connects to Bill's point earlier about being honest with our fields and saying, this is going to be hard and you're going to suffer through it and some people aren't going to make it, right? Or there's a great chapter in the next book on teaching tragedy, actually, as a valuable thing, kind of helping people see that sometimes lives don't end as in the rosy Hollywood ending that you're thinking about. And what are you going to do if yours doesn't, really, right? I mean, getting people prepared for that mentally, because it's going to happen. Because I do think we shortchange them when we make it sound like it's all going to be great because you have education from our institution, so you're on the right path, right? As opposed to all those poor suckers who are somewhere else, right? That's the PR motive, I think, that motivates a lot.
I have a friend right now who's editing a book on theology and failure, and I think it should be good. It would be interesting if an alumni magazine of a major university would do an issue on failure. Because it's always success, highlighting our alumni that have done wonderful things. But it would be wonderful to have a failure issue.
Yeah.
So if anybody knows the editor of the Baylor alumni magazine, suggest that.
Really quickly, if you can do your question in 30 seconds, we can squeeze it in here.
Okay. I want to ask about parental authority, especially if your parents' personal narrative differed from yours. For example, this whole idea of calling and vocation. If your parents went to college in the 60s, you would be like, I don't know what you're talking about. I had to pay my college debts. I got a job, And then you come up with this idea that you want to become a public school teacher and make $33,000 a year because you feel like God is calling you to that. You go home for Christmas and you try to explain this to your parents, about your sense of calling. How do you negotiate that conversation?
Good question.
Well, in response to the previous question, I'm sitting here thinking it's a reminder of the obvious, but let's not forget that a lot of this work, and it is very time-consuming but joyful, is mentoring conversation. So it's the one-on-one, and so it's drawing out of the student, where are they coming from? What are the parents' expectations? Because that frequently is a part of their anxiety. And then this is why we have to be careful, because cookie cutter programming doesn't really get at this. It sort of there has to be a part of this that's one-on-one in conversation. So then flagging that it's going to be an issue when they go home for Christmas. I sometimes do this with my first year students when I know they're going to go home for fall break, just sort of it's going to be strange.
Yeah.
Maybe rehearsing the conversation. so that they can practice putting into words how they're thinking about things. I try and remind my students that, their parents, want what's best for them, but in their own way are probably negotiating their own fears. I think about this when students are considering going abroad, maybe against the parents' hopes. So it's not very specific, but I think the reality is so much of this takes place in the one-on-one conversations. So it's sort of...
And it's not the only difficult conversation they're likely to have with their parents. But I do think sometimes it jumps too quickly to the end of the conversation, right? You gave a great example. I want to do this job. It's going to pay this much. And that's kind of where all the focus is. Not, I think I'm this kind of person, or I'm finding that I have these gifts, or my professor tells me I'm really good at this, right? I mean, that's a much more open, that question opens the conversation as opposed to the one that closes it off. And this again is why, if we can draw back from the idea that of called to a job, and get more into the question of gifts and talents, and what are my own capabilities and capacities, and where am I hearing these voices from, who's suggesting to me that I'm good or not so good at this or that, might be an easier way into the conversation than the jump to the thing that parents are really worried about. I know, I got one kid in gender studies and the other in Russian literature. I got to do my own retirement fund. I'm not going to get into that. Thank you very much. I've got some things up here on the screen for you. The first is the website for NetView if you want to find out more about that. The second is the blog, vocationmatters.org. The most recent post up there is by Hannah Schell. It's a great post about her student Jeff, who is trying to do vocational discernment starting from nothing. You may have experienced students and friends in this kind of mode. And then finally, that's our Twitter handle at the bottom, at Vocation Matters. Please feel free to follow. We will not fill up your Twitter box with junk. We don't put that much in there, but we are doing a few tweets related to the conference, so you might find that interesting as well. Thank you all very much for being here.